people forget that Jim Crow started more in the North and it didn't come to the South until after the Civil War.
While it is true that Jim Crow laws and practices were not limited to the South, it is also important to note that they were most prevalent in the southern states following the Civil War and during the period of Reconstruction. This was due in part to the fact that the South had a larger black population and a history of slavery and segregation, which made it easier for white supremacists to gain political power and enforce discriminatory policies. Additionally, the federal government's efforts to protect the rights of African Americans in the South during Reconstruction were met with significant resistance from white supremacists, which led to the eventual collapse of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow laws in the region.
Well, you have to remember there's a difference between taking the most advantage of a situation and being the one that brought about the situation.
That's true. It's one thing to take advantage of existing rules and circumstances to gain an advantage, but it's another thing entirely to have actively created or manipulated those rules and circumstances in the first place. The former is simply savvy politics, while the latter can be seen as unethical or even corrupt.
In the South, simply took advantage of Northern segregation laws.
It's important to note the segregation laws in the North were not as extensive or as harsh as those in the South. While some northern cities had segregation laws, they were not enforced as strictly or comprehensively as they were in the South. Additionally, segregation in the North was often de facto rather than de jure, meaning that it was the result of social and economic conditions rather than explicit laws. That being said, it is true that Southern segregationists often pointed to Northern segregation as a justification for their own policies. They argued that if the North could segregate its communities without criticism, then the South should be allowed to do the same. However, this argument ignores the fact that Northern segregation was not as severe as institutionalized as it was in the South, and that many Northerners were actively working to dismantle segregation in their communities.
Where they argued by principle. It seems pretty silly to argue that segregation is only bad if it extends beyond a certain point.
I understand your point, but the argument against segregation wasn't necessarily about a certain point beyond which it became bad. Rather, the argument was that segregation itself was unjust and violated basic human rights and dignity. It was not a matter of degree, but rather a matter of principle. The idea was that everyone, regardless of their race, should have equal access to public facilities, education, and job opportunities, and that segregation prevented this from happening. It was seen as a way of keeping one group of people oppressed and limiting their opportunities for advancement. Therefore, the argument was not about a certain level of segregation being acceptable, but rather that segregation itself was inherently wrong.
The South was making the principal argument. Basically, how is the North going to condemn them for placing segregation laws in place when the North was doing the same thing?
While it is true that northern states also had segregation laws in place, it is important to note that these laws were not as strict or as widespread as in the South. Furthermore, northern segregation laws were typically directed towards African Americans, while in the South they were directed towards African Americans and other minority groups, such as Native Americans and Asian Americans. Additionally, the North had already begun to take steps towards desegregation by the time the South implemented Jim Crow laws, such as the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments and the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So while the South may have been making a principal argument, their argument was flawed and did not take into account the historical and societal context of segregation in America.
But it should be clear that the South really didn't have the segregation like the North until afterwards. People were more segregated along class lines and race lines.
While it is true that the North also had segregation laws and practices, it is important to note that the segregation in the South was enforced through laws and violence in a much more extreme and systemic way than in the North. In the South, segregation was enforced through Jim Crow laws, which mandated separate facilities and services for black and white citizens, and through violence and intimidation by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. In the North, while there was still segregation in some areas, it was generally less institutionalized and less extreme. Additionally, the North did not have the same history of slavery and racism as the South, which also contributed to differences in attitudes and practices towards segregation.
A bit of hypocrisy that the South pointed about the North is they say they hated slavery, but yet the North was more willing to take Southern money that came from slavery.
Yes, that's true. The Northern economy was closely tied to the Southern economy through trade and other financial transactions. Northern banks and businesses often invested in Southern plantations and industries that relied on slave labor. Even after the abolition of slavery, the North continued to benefit from the economic legacy of slavery in the South.
That's why the North really wanted slavery to stay where it was at. They viewed it as a good way they could make money through banks and other businesses, and by it staying there, they didn't have to worry about the slaves taking Northern jobs.
While there were certainly Northern businessmen who benefited from the slave economy, it's not accurate to say that the North wanted slavery to stay in the South. The issue of slavery was a major political and moral divide between the North and South, and it was a major factor that led to the Civil War. Many in the North were vehemently opposed to slavery on moral grounds, and they saw it as a violation of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Furthermore, the North's economy was becoming more industrialized and less dependent on agriculture, so there was less need for the labor that slavery provided. While there were certainly Northern businesses that profited from the slave economy, it's not accurate to say that the North as a whole wanted slavery to continue in the South.
Lincoln took that position. He said that while he thought slavery was bad, he didn't really have the power to do anything about it besides try to do what Jefferson did and keep it in the South.
Yes, that's correct. Lincoln believed that the federal government did not have the power to abolish slavery in the states where it already existed, but he was opposed to its expansion into new territories and states. He believed that if slavery were confined to the states where it already existed, it would eventually wither away over time. This position was known as free soil, and it was the basis for Lincoln's opposition to the expansion of slavery in the United States.
Lincoln's opposition to slavery wasn't entirely moral. He opposed it as well because of his own upbringing, where he had to be uprooted from his home as a child because his father lost jobs to slaves.
It's true that Lincoln's opposition to slavery was informed by his experiences and beliefs, which were shaped by his upbringing in a frontier society. However, Lincoln also had a strong moral opposition to slavery and believed that it violated the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which held that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights. He saw slavery as a moral wrong that was incompatible with the ideals of democracy and individual freedom, and he worked to end it both as a matter of principle and practical necessity.
He was more against private plantation slavery than slavery as a whole. For example, Lincoln never opposed other examples of forced labor, such as conscription or prison labor.
It's true that Lincoln focused his opposition on the practice of private plantation slavery in the South, rather than opposing forced labor in general. However, Lincoln did oppose conscription during the Civil War, and he faced significant opposition from those who objected to being drafted. As for prison labor, it's worth noting that the use of prisoners for labor was much widespread during Lincoln's time than it is today.
I think what people fail to realize is that you can use previous movements to determine a likely reason a future movement does something.
Yes, historical context and precedent can be very important in understanding current events and movements. By examining past movements and their goals, strategies, and tactics, we can gain insight into the motivations and strategies of current movements. However, it is important to recognize that each movement is unique and may have its own distinct characteristics and motivations. It is also important to recognize the limitations of historical analogies and not to assume that past events and movements will necessarily repeat themselves in the present.
For example, the South wasn't the only people that threatened secession. Guys like Rufus King did as well.
Rufus King did threaten secession during the Hartford Convention in 1814. Along with other New England Federalists, they were opposed to the War of 1812 and felt that the federal government was not adequately representing their interests. However, the threat of secession never materialized, and the convention ultimately resulted in a set of proposed constitutional amendments rather than a push for secession.
Rufus King's reasons were that he felt Southern interests were dominating Northern interests.
Yes, Rufus King was concerned about the political power that the Southern states had over the North, particularly in the areas of trade and taxation. He feared that the South would continue to use its political power to protect and expand the institution of slavery, which he believed was detrimental to the economic and moral progress of the country. King believed that if the North could not gain greater control over government, then secession might be necessary to protect Northern interests and ensure the continuation of the American experiment in Republican governments.
People never seem to apply that history to the Southern secession cause.
Yes, it's important to understand the historical context factors that contributed to the Southern secession cause, including economic, social, and political factors. While slavery was a major issue, it was not the only issue, and secession was also motivated by concerns about states' rights, economic policies, and regional interests. Understanding the complexity of these issues can help us gain a more nuanced understanding of the events leading up to the Civil War and the motivations behind them.
Like the reason why the South wanted to leave was for the inverse of why Rufus King wanted secession. They felt Northern interests would dominate Southern interests.
Yes, that's a common interpretation of the reasons behind the Southern secession. The Southern states believed that the federal government was becoming too powerful and that the Northern states were using their majority in Congress to pass laws that benefited them at the expense of the South. They also believed that the federal government was not doing enough to protect their interests, particularly in regard to the issue of slavery. Southern leaders felt that they could better protect their interests by forming their own country, free from the influence of the North.